Good afternoon and welcome to chapter 6 of the series of videos on social and cultural changes in the UK in the 1970s. And we're moving into 1975 because I'm taking it chronologically, although it's also supposed to be a reflection on what questions should historians be asking about the 1970s. What is history? Who writes history? Who do they write it for, and why do they write it? And we already spoke in class about the fact that there's always an audience. So you write a school textbook in a different way from you write a museum exhibition or a history book for specialists. Let's see what was big in 1975. This is the only photograph I could find of him, actually. He doesn't look very happy about it, but Donald Coggan became in 1975 the new Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the highest ranked cleric in the Church of England, although I'm sure you remember the Queen, or the monarch, is the head of the Church of England, which is not something specific to Britain. I believe that in Sweden or Denmark, one of them, the monarch is also the head of the church, which seems to be something from another age when the secular power and religious belief were more firmly meshed together. And this gentleman became slowly known as a firm supporter of the ordination of women. Now, whether this was partly motivated by the idea that the church was declining in relevance and would have more chance of having influence in society if it had women priests as well, or for some other reason, I'm not quite sure. And in fact, it will be in 1994, so 20 years later, that women priests will first be ordained in the Anglican Church in Britain. This to open up the question of where does the history of religion fit, because although well, for the longest time people have always said, oh well, religion is declining, which is of course true, that the influence of religion is declining. Nevertheless, if you look at the number of people who do get their children baptized or use a church for a funeral, you're still talking about some of the biggest organizations in Britain, and indeed across the world. Although there are countries where religion is declining, there are other countries where it is really, or in fact maybe even going in the opposite direction. Christianity has always been tremendously flexible, which is one of the ways it's been able to survive for such a long time. During the same year, 1975, I'm going to talk about a couple of these cultural events in a moment, but March 1975 was also the moment when unemployment exceeded 1 million. By now we have a Labour government back in office, and so of course unemployment rates rarely react very directly to changes in government. But this was a symbolic number, 1 million. It hadn't been 1 million forever. It was probably since before the Second World War, and this was tremendously worrying to people, although in the 80s it would reach 3 million. In April 1975, the classic film Monty Python and the Holy Grail was released, and indeed in France, Monty Python are better known through their films than through the TV sketches. April 1975 was also the moment of the first episode of the BBC sitcom The Good Life, which is a wonderful sitcom which you can see on YouTube. I wonder how dated it feels to people today. It's a simple story, as sitcom should be. The story of a couple who give up. Well, the man gives up his job as a high-flying designer in a big company, well paid, because he wants to go with him and his wife want to go back to nature, in inverted commas. They want to grow their own food, and raise goats and pigs, etc., and make their own clothes and do all this. Okay, which was a real 1970s theme, or very much a middle class theme, of course. But it's somewhat more difficult in Britain than in France, because there's much less countryside, especially in England, much less countryside. And in any case, what made it a comedy, this series, is that they decided to make this change in lifestyle, but without moving house and remaining in the leafy, rather bourgeois suburbs where they lived, and their next door neighbors, social climbing snobs. reacted in different ways to their change in lifestyle. Excellent actors and an interesting thing, but it's something of a representative in a sense, because sitcoms have often been in British history in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and probably before, a way to comment on and joke about real social phenomena. And so sometimes very badly. Famously, the 1970s sitcom Love Thy Neighbor was commenting on racism, but it was very much a failure from that point of view, because they did it by having a black man and a white man living next door, one to the other, and they were both equally racist against the other side. Now, if it weren't like that, we would know about it. So the Good Life, in any case, was very, very popular. It got between 6 and 9 million viewers. In June 1975, for the first time ever, debates in Parliament were broadcast on the radio so that the public could listen in. So a new idea of transparency. And it is in September that 40 Towers is the sitcom which is hitting the airwaves. And the theme is again very much a social theme. It's about this gentleman played by John Cleese, who is again a social climber and obsessed with class and distinction and respectability and so on. And this very often British sitcoms seem to be about people obsessed with social distinctions. Another one which is quite well known is called Keeping Up Appearances, which I'm pretty sure is from the 1980s. This is also the moment of the opening of the National Railway Museum, which I very much recommend, which is in York. And what's significant about it from the point of view of governance of culture is this is the first major national museum outside London. That is to say that since museums began, for ordinary people, mostly in the 19th century, there had been no national museums opened outside London until 1975. So that shows something about the domination of London. There are more since. I don't have a list at all, but I know that the National Television Museum is in Bradford. There was an important report that came out on ethnic minorities and housing and showed that there had been, although there had been something of a decrease in overt discrimination by estate agents against black people, citizens from ethnic minorities still on average occupied housing which was very much inferior to that occupied by white people. In October 1975, Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody was released, surprising to everybody because it was far longer than any record was supposed to be if it wanted to get into the charts. And the Sex Pistols gave their first concert in November 1975, thus successfully becoming the icon of rebelliousness for the 1970s, for the new era of crisis, because the Trente Glorieuses, the post-war boom, was well and truly on its way out. And punk was to be an aesthetic rebellion against upbeat national unity in the crisis. So where the narrator of the rock and roll song had often been a confident young man about town, and the narrator of progressive rock had been a deep poetic dreamer, the typical narrator of a punk song was the sarcastic loser. Such refrains as "We're so pretty vacant and we don't care," or "There's no future in England's dreaming," became massively popular among young people in a society of stress and unemployment, where the optimism of the post-war boom no longer seemed appropriate. Punk rock widened considerably the number of subjects which you could sing about in a rock song, and also with its do-it-yourself aesthetic, it encouraged the setting up of thousands of punk rock bands, hundreds of local magazines, and a series of small independent record labels, which together would have a huge influence on British popular music. So there you go. Interestingly enough, their first concert was in an art school. Yeah, that is in an institution of higher education where people go to practice being artists or to learn to be artists. So that does not sound a very it doesn't sound like the bottom of society and working class misery, but that's where the the aesthetic rebellion came from, which was then identified, and which then many working class young people identified with. Interestingly enough, contrary to what one might think, there was considerably more space for women in punk than there had been in rock and roll. The Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act came into effect in 1975. Sometimes when they pass laws, it says this will be come into effect in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, to give companies the time to deal with. So this act, now the principle of equal pay for women had originally been proposed in the 1959 election manifesto of the Labour Party, but it had been taken some time to get forward. Yes, and so the Equal Pay Act will be obviously an important reform. Now, in 1975, just a couple of statistics, a couple of events without dates in 1975. Social spending amounted to 19.4% of gross national product, whereas in 1960, it had only been 12.4% of a far smaller gross domestic product. The first meetings of the Gay Labour Group were held, lobbying inside the Labour Party for gay liberation to be taken more seriously. So here you can see the slow progress that in 1967 you get the decriminalisation, but not carried out from the point of view of genuine sympathy, well, from genuine support for equal love. And during the 70s, you first of all get the mobilisation of homosexual groups, and then the left political parties say, "Oh yeah, we need to understand this question. We can see now that there's injustice. We need to fight for it." And here is one example that the first meeting, the Gay Labour Group is established, and the far left, the revolutionary left, in particular the Socialist Workers' Party, would the following year become very much involved in gay liberation, and they're very old gentlemen. The very old gentleman who was their leader, their historic leader, would write the article, why socialists should support gays, which would make a big difference in the organisation. This is also the moment when Angela Rippon becomes the first ever regular woman newsreader, and I think I've already mentioned the importance of the role of newsreader. This is somebody who tells us how to understand the world. And if they're all old men, that has a meaning, has a symbolic meaning for everybody to understand. And there she is, Angela Rippon, suffering from that terrible situation that she had to wear clothes from the 1970s. This is also in 1975, Jackie Tabick became the first qualified rabbi in Britain in the Jewish community. She was born in Dublin and moved to Britain. And I think that's publications. What was published in 1975? I don't think I found any significant publications in 1975. So we're going to move on to 1976, and 1976 is a symbolic year from another point of view, that when in 2004, when the New Economics Foundation released a report examining how the quality of life had developed since the Second World War, something not necessarily very easy to understand, but certainly, obviously, if you have a job, you're not worried about losing your job. You have a decent wage, your housing is of good quality, etc. And they decided that 1976 was the year since the war with the best quality of life. That is to say, after all of, or most of the advantages of the post-war boom had come in, better housing, free doctors, and free doctors is something which obviously is a good thing immediately, but in fact, one gets the benefit of over 20 years, because if you have free doctors, you get better diagnosis, so your illnesses are discovered earlier, and life in general gets better. So the 1976 was a moment when the benefits of the post-war boom had come in, and the harshness of mass unemployment had not yet begun to hit. Nevertheless, there were many more advances still to go, and some of them Some of them were due to the post-war boom. For example, housing was getting better every decade. And how housing works is that when you have a new law that says, okay, all new houses must have this quality. But as you can imagine, because houses, you build so many every year, but many people live in houses which are 20 years old, 50 years old, and so on. So the benefit of the new law can be quite slow to work its way through, and that is why housing conditions continue to improve in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, sometimes on the basis of laws which have been brought in previously. In January 1976, the House of Commons rejected by 181 votes against 120, a proposal to end corporal punishment in state schools. That is, that somebody, can't remember who, somebody proposed there should be a law saying that schools could not hit children. And this was rejected. So the parliament said, no, you may continue hitting children in schools. This was very much a debate at the time in the 1970s. Very much a debate. In fact, in debating classes in school, they used to debate this sort of thing, and the practice was very different from one school to another. You could have a school where many children were being hit every day, and you could have schools where it was once every few months somebody got hit. So it was very varied. It was finally banned by law in 1987, so just 11 years later. And once it was banned, I think the debate was won in a way. And it's a strange phenomenon, the relationship between public attitudes and laws. It's not unusual that the law changes first, and then majority public attitudes come to join the opinion of the law. Certainly when they banned capital punishment in Britain at the end of the 60s, those of us who are against capital punishment were very happy that there was not a referendum, because it was far from clear that the majority of the population agreed with the new law. Symbolic in February 1976 was the Grunwick strike, and this was a strike at a photo developing factory where the fairly young Asian women went on strike. And it was the counterexample to the previous one I mentioned about the Imperial Typewriters strike, because it was very strongly supported by a large number of trade unions who came along in thousands to demonstrate in front of the factory. It was a very long strike, and it was partly successful. And as you can see underneath, which is even more interesting, you get many years later a proposal to commemorate the strike with a mural, so that the strike became part of popular culture, part of community memory, and no doubt this is sponsored by some trade union, decided that it would be nice to have a mural to remember it, so that you have this unofficial history being drawn and unofficial commemorations being organized. As you can imagine, the Prime Minister didn't say, oh, let's commemorate the Grunwick strike. It was more a down thing up. April 1976 is the first ever female British ambassador. Again, this is another example of roles which the vast majority of the population can never dream of getting near, but nevertheless, where the symbolic importance of opening them up to women is significant. The first ever female British ambassador was appointed in Denmark. So they weren't taking huge risks. They could have appointed it in Iran or Argentina, but they decided to start with Denmark, where I imagined that she would cause less surprise. You have here. I've lost my notes here. Just to bear with me. You have here an interesting example. This is a magazine called Achilles Heel, and this is a men's pro-feminist magazine. That is to say, there was an important women's movement, not centralized, and there was a much smaller set of men's networks of men who wanted to support the women's liberation movement. And for example, some of them had men's groups, and one of the things that some of the men's group would do would be offer to organize the creche, the childcare at feminist events, or women's liberation events. But they decided to have their magazine, where what they're doing is analyzing the role of men in oppression, and looking at how men can avoid, how men can help change and fight sexism, and how men can avoid being pushed into the oppressor role. So a very interesting phenomenon, whatever one's opinion might be. Unfortunately, there is no online, what's the word? There's no online archive of this. Certainly if anybody feels like doing any research, I don't think anybody's really done any work on this. Oh, there you go. Look, crime are men to blame. Prostitution, is it necessary, or is it horrible? I can't read actually exactly what we're going. Black masculinity. So you can see the sort of questions they looked at. Interestingly, the cover there is Punch, in the traditional puppet show going back centuries, Punch and Judy, where one of the key scenes, which happens every time, is that Punch beats his wife with a stick. You see, and that's supposed to be funny, and was considered to be funny for a very, very long time. In November 1976, the Race Relations Act introduces for the first time the concept of indirect discrimination, and that is to say that if a policy of a company is indirectly discriminatory, then that's not allowed. Previously, they could only be contested in the tribunals if they had something open, saying, we do not employ black people. That was illegal. However, they would find that people would try to get around, companies would try to get around it. So, for example, if there was a case where they had a uniform, the company had a uniform and they had a hat, and they refused to employ a Sikh man who wore a turban, because not because he was Sikh, but because you got to have the right uniform, and this was deemed under the new law would have been deemed to be racist and therefore illegal. Now, many people considered that the Race Relations Act was essentially symbolic, and the Commission for Racial Equality, which was established at the same time, was very weak and didn't have many teeth. And that's certainly true. On the other hand, it was probably the best set of laws in Europe at that time, and it did lay the basis for later policy informations, such as the institution in 2002 of the duty of British public organisations to promote racial equality, and the measures passed against Islamophobia in 2003. Now, participation in public life by non-white citizens advanced slowly. By 1982, there were 76 borough councillors of Asian or West Indian origin on London's Borough Council. And it was in the 80s and 90s that these numbers began to rise. And perhaps the symbolic change was 2016, when the present mayor of London, is he still the mayor of London? In any case, when Sadiq Khan became the mayor of London, as his name no doubt tells you, he is of South Asian origin. In 1976, the Brotherhood of Man won the Eurovision Song Contest with a song entitled "Save All Your Kisses for Me." And although I don't usually do this, I think that this particular song is so in many ways so terrible that I have to show it to you, but only if I can find the. I don't know if this is going to work. Actually, I don't know if it's going to work. Perhaps it will. Let's see. No, Oh yes, maybe I can. I can do it down there, down here. It's an absolutely dreadful piece of music, in my opinion. But on the other hand, maybe perhaps the dreadful music of a period represents the age better than the best musical period. In any case, no, I'm not going to be able to show it to you because of the problems of technology. But I recommend you to. I recommend you to look at it. So let me just get back to my PowerPoint. I'll try to put it on the blog for the students in Hall. August 1976, conflict between the police and young black people in Notting Hill for the carnival. And also in 1976, the first intercity trains, the 125 trains. Now, Britain has never been has not been able to impress Europeans with its trains for quite a long time. And I'm afraid it hasn't got much better in the last 50 years. The Sex Pistols there enjoying being provocative, and there they appeared on a television show. And as you can see, one of them, I'm not sure which one of them is wearing a Nazi armband. And this is absolutely not because he was a Nazi or on the far right. It was simply because he thought, what can I wear which will annoy the old people the most? And so that's why they did this. And it's a rather bizarre show where the normally very polite producer tries to oblige them to say very rude, taboo words. Says, well, what would you say if you wanted to be really rude? It's always bizarre because he just wants to be the television program where the Sex Pistols use bad words on television. On television. So what was first published in 1976, the Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, which was the beginnings of, or which was along the same dynamic as a current of sociobiology, which said, what matters is not people's education, is not how society is organized, is not political conflict or cultural development. It is genetics controls everything. And the main difficulty with this is that it tended to say, oh, well, if men dominate in society, it's genetic, it's natural, so nothing you can do about it. And this became quite popular among sections of the hard right, which just leaves a little time to move on to 1977. Ken Loach was working, and one of his early TV plays was called The Price of Coal, very good one. I don't know if you can find that one on the. I don't know if you'll find that one on the on YouTube. You probably can. The Prime Minister, James Callaghan, officially opened the M5 motorway. And in June, Jubilee celebrations were held across the United Kingdom to celebrate 25 years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, with a public holiday on the 7th of June. And in a large number of towns, popular street parties were organized, which is particularly interesting because the English are not really a great street party sort of people, not just because it rains. Fascinatingly, for the 50th anniversary, you might imagine that for the 50th anniversary of the Queen's coming to the throne, you would have an even bigger party and even more popular street parties. This was not the case. The popularity of the royal family was on the decline. Difficult to say what it is today. Actually, it's had worse moments. The Clash brought out their album, and Bob Marley brought out his extremely well-known reggae album. And reggae had been tremendously popular at the beginning of the 70s among Black communities. And the 70s is the decade when it comes into wider circulation. And Bob Marley becomes the best-known representative. Now, some reggae fans will claim that Bob Marley was put forward because it was the peace and love and very harmless rebellion side of reggae, whereas some other reggae singers were much more subversive. Tremendously huge scandal about a blasphemy trial, and now what happened here was that the gay newspaper, Gay News, printed many articles and poems and stories. But one day one day they printed a particularly provocative poem about Jesus Christ having sex with another man. You can find it on the web if you need to. And it was attacked not under an obscenity law, but under a very old law which was almost never used, a blasphemy law which made it illegal to insult certain religious values or tenets, because much of the left, and at this time much of the left defended gay news because they claimed that the real reason for the case was prejudice against homosexuals. More productions here. The Sex Pistols release their album with a rude word on the front, unsurprisingly, and Queen release News of the World. Undated thing from this time. It's also the first time that Star Wars is shown in British cinemas, incidentally, and the history of food is tremendously important. How much does it affect people's lives? Food? Well, I don't know, but the Golden Wonder launched in 1977. This product, pot noodle, you just add water and it's got noodles. And it was considered at the time to be symbolic of a new era of eating habits, where the food is not necessarily of very good quality and is certainly prepared very quickly indeed. In 2016, the factory in Wales still produced 175 million pot noodles every year. This is also the moment when colour television licenses outnumbered black and white television licenses for the first time in the United Kingdom. This has a certain importance because looking at black and white clips from the early 70s or before, people sometimes get the impression that people lived in black and white and so didn't get very excited. This is actually not true, I'm told. I'm not old enough to know this. We got to the end of 1977 and also to the end of the half hour, so I'm going to stop there. There will be more. There are a couple of years left. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.